So we're part of this project that is called the AIDS Activist History Project, where we're doing interviews with people who were involved with AIDS activism in the Canadian context in kind of the mid to late 80s through the mid 90s. Yeah, so that's why we're here in Montreal right now.
Okay, so we did a presentation last night and we're going to do a workshop quite soon.
Yeah. We were living in Sudbury, where Gary taught, and I taught also there. And I knew from being involved with Gary in political work that he had done some really substantial activism around HIV and AIDS in Toronto and the Maritimes. And at the time, I was doing a little bit of a research project with an oral history project focusing on an activist group in New York City called ACT UP New York. And they had an oral history project where they were interviewing people and you could read their transcripts and hear what they did in their own words. And I thought this was just wonderful. And I asked Gary, I was writing something about it and I wanted to just say something very quick and comparative about the difference between the US context and the Canadian context, because they had to do a lot of struggles for, basic health care for people. That was a big focus because of the health situation there. And Gary said, well, we did all these things, but I don't think there's anything written down anywhere that you could cite in your paper. And I said, well, we should apply for some money and we should do some interviews and we should change this. And Gary said, we're never going to get any money. That's impossible. And I said, I know, it's probably impossible, but we'll try.
But then we got the money.
So
we have to do it. No. Yeah. So we're really pleased to be doing a recovery, basically, of the narratives and stories of AIDS activists in a number of centers across the country. So the centers are Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and also Ottawa, which is where Alexis is now teaching and living. So it's been a really profound experience of collecting all of these narratives and stories. And we're putting them online. Actually, yesterday we launched the first wave of our Montreal interviews. So people can actually access them, although I can't off the top of my head tell you what the website is.
Well, so if people go to aidsactivisthistory.ca, there's a link that has all these interviews that we've posted so far, little video clips and the full transcripts of the whole thing. So it's cool. We've been doing it for now three and a half years. We have another year and a half still of money to travel and do all the transcription and the translation, and so it's amazing.
And part of the imperative is the stories that we're collecting were actually really important stories of how people survived, how they resisted, and how they changed things. They actually improved the situation for people living with AIDS and HIV, especially through forms of activism, including direct action, taking over the opening sessions of conferences, die-ins, occupations of buildings. These all actually played a major role in altering the situation and improving the situation for people living with AIDS and HIV. These activist experiences are in danger of being forgotten, lost, and we really think it's important for people to remember them and to perhaps be inspired by them, or at least to learn from them about how activism can go forward in the historical present that we live in relationship to AIDS, but also other questions as well.
Well, I think one strand of a reason that some things are forgotten is that often we want it to be pretty easy to solve complex problems. And so a dominant narrative that gets told now is that the problem was that there was this disease and there wasn't enough resources being put toward a medical solution. And that's totally true. There were lots of things that were not being done that should have been done, that could have been done in terms of medical research, access to drugs, correct investigation into what was actually happening. So all of that is true. But it's also true that alongside needing more medical research, more access to treatment, there was also these profound social things. And so one of the things that I think we've really found and that we want to always emphasize is that so many people lived and had dignified lives with HIV and AIDS because of profound social movement struggle. So that it was not only medical ever, it was also people recognizing that it was people living in poverty, racialized people who had multiple forms of being on social relations of inequality, that those people died first. So that in order to really address HIV and AIDS as a crisis, as a social crisis, you had to have social movement, and you had to have a kind of transformation of the world. So I think that a kind of neoliberal approach that says we just need to fix the technical problem really erases all of that vital work that people did to say we need to make it so that people are not living in poverty, and that will help them live longer. We need to make it so that people have access to education so that they understand what's happening. So we need, people in prison to have access to clean needles and condoms. And so really, I think that's one of the things that I've been so moved by in doing these interviews, is just how thorough the activists were in their analysis of what was at stake and what the problem was and what the solutions could be.
I mean, I think there's a sort of dominant narrative now that activism doesn't work, that it doesn't achieve anything, and somehow it was the medical profession and governments who saved us from the AIDS crisis. And I mean, really, it's a very different story that we're allowing people to find out about, which is a story that said governments didn't do anything until they were forced to do it. And it was actually community-based groups who stepped up and took care of people and fought against discrimination. And it was also AIDS activist groups who expanded the possibilities of treatment for people to be able to survive. If we'd left it up to the governments and the medical profession, people would just have been dying. So, I mean, literally in a certain sense, what the slogan of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP in New York City, was silence equals death, but action equals life. And I think in some ways, by trying to actively remember in an embodied way these histories of activism, we're really trying to give life to action, to that slogan of action equals life.
And then today, it's important that it's not just the other dominant narrative is we finally got better medicine. We got highly active retroviral combination therapies in 1996, and now everything's fine, everyone's good, no one needs to worry about this anymore. And so there's something that's also really important about recognizing that Canada is still leading the world in criminalizing people with HIV, still has incredibly draconian, horrific practices about what happens to people if they're having sex while positive. So it's not at all over. And so if we think that, it's a medical problem, it's solved, then we also stop thinking about what needs to happen now. It's still, the struggle continues, actually. Mm-hmm. So I think that when we think about what it means to be entangled or part of this history of thinking about AIDS activism, for me, one of the things that I really think about is the way that so much of what these people did provide the conditions for people's lives today. So in terms of having people who are living with diseases, having a voice on the medical bodies of treatments for those diseases, having really rich capacities for people to have access to information about medicine. All of these things were because people of the past that we're trying to, understand and think about, they won these things. So we actually need to understand that we're entangled with and reliant on AIDS activists of the past, and that AIDS is ours in terms of that history. And also that we're responsible, just in virtue of being alive and remembering that connection, for continuing that work, for continuing to transform. So I think in the book I have a chapter that's about remembering the history of medical activism as a way of holding responsibility toward a future that those people built for us and that we need to build for other people. Yeah, so that's that quality of we're implicated because they did this for us. We're responsible. Yeah.
Here are Gary and Alexis.
Okay, thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. Gary and I start every public presentation that we give with acknowledgement of where we are. So it's really wonderful to be a guest here in Kanien'kehá:ka territory, eastern gateway to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, I live on unceded Algonquin territory. Gary is visiting from Tigmishing Anishinaabeg land, and it's wonderful to be here. And I know we say this a lot, do these land acknowledgements. And for me, I also always like to say that when we do this, it's both a recognition of past relations and a kind of commitment to future relations based on a kind of decolonizing practice of resistance, which for me and for us, I think, in this project is really centrally about what it means to remember the relations that we're in order to create different kinds of worlds that people have been working on for a very long time. So not a kind of just pat acknowledgement of the past, but actually a practice of acknowledgement for different futures. So we're really tremendously honored to be here tonight. It's wonderful. We were telling Tom that we are totally not at all ready to do this, and that it's quite a pleasure to be forced to. So thank you so much. And I think we wanted to also start by dedicating, so we're very cheesy, you'll find this. So we also are dedicating this to Kalpesh Oza. Kalpesh was a really important organizer and scientist. He lived here in Montreal, and then he's widely identified in Toronto activist scenes as the most fabulous person, and they attribute this to the fact that he came from Montreal to them. And so he's someone who should not have died, and we're thinking of him. So sometimes I joke that the way that we started this project was that I said to Gary, let's go talk to all the people that you've had sex with about AIDS organizing. That's not how it actually started. What happened was that I had a lover who was doing work on AIDS in New York, and I knew Gary from, we lived in Sudbury together, and she said, you know, what's happened in Canada? What's the situation in Canada? And so I said to Gary, what's the situation in Canada? Who's doing this kind of history? And we looked around, and there really wasn't anyone who was doing oral histories of people who had done incredible things, who had transformed the world, that was being done from the point of view of not having a kind of journalistic or academic pet project. So we really looked at that, and we thought it would be important, it would be good to actually understand and capture some of what happened as people did it in their own words, without trying to rationalize it or make it fit into some plan. And so we thought we would try to do that. And I think one of the things that you'll find as we're talking tonight is that we've only unevenly succeeded at that. There's lots of failure built into a project like this. And so, as Ross said, we're really hoping to start this as a beginning, and a kind of insufficient beginning, but one that we hope is a good start. Built into the name of our project is this idea that we're looking at activist history. And I wanted to just say something about that. We're focusing on a moment after there had been quite substantial, quite meaningful, quite radical response to provide services that the state was not giving to people who were sick, who were dying. So this was a wave of what have now become what we call AIDS service organizations. And those people did amazing things. And it's important, I think, for us to notice why we're taking this kind of other tack to do this thing called activism. So there came this wave of people who also said, we need to have a political response to this. This is not just a medical problem. This is not just a care problem. One of the people that we interviewed in Nova Scotia said, it came to be that there were a lot of people who would hold your hand while you were dying, but there was no one that was fighting to keep you alive. And he said, we wanted to do that. We wanted to fight to live. So these were people that took a political response, and it was always entangled with a care response. And I think in the Canadian context, it's important that we point this out because it is different here than it was in the US, where because the healthcare system is so shitty, just giving care to someone is more political. It's still political here. Like, we just were talking to someone in Vancouver who said that one of her forms of activism was to go and hold people in the hospital during the time when, you know, they would just leave the plate of food outside and not touch anyone who was in hospital. So we're focusing on activism in these, and on especially political organizing that did collective work. And what that means is that there's a lot of complexity that we can pull in, and a lot of complexity that is not treated very well. So this is one of our successes and one of our failures. So the stories that we tell are also limited, and they're also partial. And we try to just be very upfront about that, because we're participating in a way of thinking about what Gary, in his work, which I share with Ross, the injunction that we should all read it, has theorized really richly as the social organization of forgetting and the resistance of remembering. So the things that are remembered, the things that are known, and the things that are forgotten, it's not that there's a grand conspiracy where someone's sitting around figuring out what is going to be remembered and what is going to be forgotten. There's not like someone who's just like practicing their evil demon laugh. We will not remember histories of AIDS activism. But the way that the social world is organized means that some things are not remembered, some things are forgotten. And there's a poem by a Puerto Rican about how many people from Puerto Rico were killed in the Pulse massacre in Orlando, who said, if it seems random, it's systemic, right? So if it seems random that we haven't remembered things, maybe that's something we actually need to pay attention to, and maybe we need to resist that forgetting. We need to remember. So the focus for tonight is on these two organizations that we think really should be remembered here in Montreal, Réaction, SIDA, and ACT UP Montreal. And we're also so happy and delighted to launch tonight the first wave of the Montreal interviews that we've collected. So Gary was passing out these little postcards. If you'd like one, they have a little blurb, we can pass them around. And the website, all but 3 of them have been translated. The very valiant person who's been doing all the translation for most of our interviews, Jordan, is here, who's been translating our French interview into English. But some of the English interviews aren't quite done because our translator has a little health hiccup, so they all will be translated into French soon.
The first thing I wanted to talk to you about is the AIDS activism we're talking about tonight occurs in a broader social and political context. So just to paint in some of the features of that, Penny Pattison, who was an activist involved in Réaction SIDA, emphasized to us that in the late 80s, early 90s, we have to remember this was also the period of the rise of the Quebec sovereignty movement, that provided an important political context for all forms of organizing that was going on in Quebec society. It's also the period where there's the beginning of the emergence of neoliberalism as a social and political perspective, where the imperatives to cut back on healthcare funding and other social programming is really coming into play, including for governments in Quebec. Karen Herland, who was also involved in Réaction SIDA, tells us a little bit about the rapidity of the events that occurred in 1989 and 1990, which is the initial context we're starting off talking about tonight. So in June 1989, Karen tells us, is the International AIDS Conference. January 1990 is when ACT UP Montreal starts. Sex Garage, which we'll talk about later, is in July 1990. So it's not a huge period of time. In between, there's also the Polytechnic, the anti-feminist Montreal massacre of 14 women at École Polytechnique in December. And the Oka crisis in Ganasatake and Ganawaki is parallel to Sex Garage. And also that summer, there was a lot of concern in the black community around racial profiling and the police having shot or detained young black men. Another part of the context, especially on the local scene, was the murder of Joe Rose on March 19, 1989, which helped to create the context in which Réaction SIDA emerges. It's also important to point out that violence against gays and murders was actually a consistent feature of the late 80s and early 1990s in Montreal. So that's hopefully painting a little bit of the context. Now, Karen Herland tells us a little bit about Joe Rose and the formation of Réaction SIDA. Joe Rose had been a young gay man. Everyone remembers his pink hair. He was a young gay man in his 20s who was living with HIV. I think actually had AIDS at that point. There was an altercation and Joe got stabbed and died that night. And so that happened just at the time when we were starting to organize. And then I also remember being a bit flummoxed by everyone wanting to talk about Joe Rose. I was like, no, we have this conference to think about. Why are we talking about Joe Rose? And then on the other hand, also realizing it's a good concrete way for us to begin to work together and to get to know each other and have a short-term goal that we can realize that we can help bind us together to organize to come.
We tried to function as much as possible as a collective. Definitely there were things that we differed on and splintered over. But, you know, things, for example, of people that wanted to, you know, work with the mainstream media or work with the police to engage in things like sensitivity training, or, you know, and other people who were really opposed to that tactic, you know. But it didn't, in the lifespan of Réaction SIDA, it was a short-lived group. You know, it didn't have a long lifespan, and like I said, it really crystallized around the AIDS conference, and I think everyone would recognize the urgency and the importance of that, and that was sort of our focus, and in that context, you know, it was clear that people were invested for different reasons, and had just sort of different skills and areas where they wanted to put their energy and how they were going to respond to it, and as much as possible, we tried to be accommodating, inclusive, so that we could have a shared response.
So Penny also told us about the sort of twofold project of Réaction SIDA. We wanted to have our own response to our own political agencies. We wanted to make demands on the Quebec government, of the Ministry of Health. And we also knew that this conference was coming up quickly and that we needed to have a response. We needed to be able to mediate all the activists who would be coming and have them understand the political context within Quebec at the time too, and to be able to engage. Now this is one of the flyers describing Réaction SIDA in French and English. I'll just read the first line of their self-description. Réaction SIDA is a sex-positive, life-affirming group of diverse women and children, and men, sorry, women and men, not women and children, who are committed. Must be some dominant trope in society that says that. So women and men who are committed to reacting directly and aggressively to the criminal silence, inaction, bungling, and distortion with which all levels of government, the media, and the medical establishment have greeted the AIDS crisis. So Réaction SIDA contacted other AIDS activist groups that they knew were planning to do things at the Montreal AIDS conference. They got in touch with AIDS Action Now in Toronto and ACT UP New York City, as well as other groups, to try to liaise with them to figure out what would be best for AIDS activism at the conference. One of the major achievements of Réaction SIDA that contributed to the success, the incredible success of AIDS activism at this conference, was that through the Milton Park Co-op, they were able to secure an action center located at Park and Pine, which was an incredible resource that week. Through that center, many events were planned, including protests against the Canadian government's record on AIDS and HIV, demands for the participation of people living with AIDS in the setting of the agenda of the conference and AIDS policy more generally, for an activist treatment agenda from ACT UP New York City, for anonymous testing, in support of sex workers, and in opposition to the widespread whore bashing that was taking place at the conference, and in solidarity with third world struggles. Now Karen is now going to tell us a little bit about the daily experience of activism at the conference. I know Karen doesn't want us to even show this, but we are showing it nonetheless.
It was just like every day, it was just this sort of like wake up, tumble down, like literally tumble down to the center, figure out what was going on for the day, spend all day in the conference space at demos, sharing information, doing all sorts of stuff. We would, you know, be making posters for the next day that night or something, and then at 11 o'clock every night we'd be in the center watching the 11 o'clock news, figuring out how we made the national news, what made the national news, where we were. Then we'd go and have some drinks, and, you know, stumble home and do it all again the next day. That was pretty much it every day.
So hopefully, Karen, I mean, that does capture, for me anyway, who was also there, quite a lot of what happened during that week. But also world events took place during that week. So the massacre of students at Tiananmen Square took place that week. We all decided to participate in a solidarity demonstration against the massacre. There were some questions raised about how prominent we should put AIDS when we marched in the solidarity contingent, but certainly everyone was solidly there in support of the student movement in China. So one of the most significant achievements for activists at this conference was the taking over or the seizure of the opening session, the opening ceremony of the conference. So this is just a picture of that, and one of the people holding the banner at that far end is actually me, a much younger version of me. So I wanted to like also implicate myself in terms of being there. And the person holding in the middle of that banner, the person holding the sign in the middle of the banner is Blaine Mosley, at least he went by Blaine Mosley at that point in time, who would play a very important role in the establishment of ACT UP Montreal. So we're now going to see an excerpt from John Brayson's wonderful, empowering, and also satirical video called The World is Sick, Sick, which is about AIDS activism at this conference. And it's about the seizure of the opening session. It will include Tim McCaskill on behalf of AIDS Action Now and opening up the conference on behalf of people living with AIDS and HIV, and will also include the first part of the disruption of Brian Mulroney's speech. So hopefully that's set up now. Yes, thank you.
Genocide. We're sick to death of your dirty death row. The world is sick of multinationals. It's time we took control. The world is sick of stupid lies. We're sick to death of sacred cows. The world is pissed with profiteering. What we want is What we want is action now. People living with AIDS in Canada and around the world, I would like to officially open the 5th International. After 5 years in office, Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister of Canada, had promised us, and promised the world, that today he, for the first time in public, was going to stand up and say the A word. Or if you speak in French, the S word. We think that not only is that unprecedented in terms of Brian Mulroney's record, but it also has to be an unprecedented piece of historical hypocrisy, given the record of the Mulroney government around AIDS.
The American agitators, after delaying the opening for over an hour, have finally dispersed, and the official ceremonies are now beginning.
AIDS has taken some of our best and our brightest, often in the prime of their professional lives. Worldwide, as many as 450,000 people may have contracted AIDS. As many as 5 million more people, or even many more, could be infected with the AIDS virus. In Canada,
So just to assist people who might not fully have understood the protests that we engaged in against Brian Mulroney, People turned their backs to him when he spoke, and people were also holding up watches to say time is running out. So there was a pretty dramatic form of protest against Mulroney. Another crucial feature of the AIDS activism at the International AIDS Conference in Montreal was the Montreal Manifesto, which was produced in French, in English, and in Spanish. And it was a really crucial manifesto or document of AIDS activism. It built on earlier principles like the Denver Principles to argue for the centrality of people living with AIDS and HIV to any social response to AIDS. It talked very clearly and very courageously about the need to transfer resources from the global north to the global south if we were going to really deal with the ravages of the AIDS crisis. And it was very clear on the need to spend money on AIDS and healthcare and not on militarism. So it's a very important document. I'd highly recommend people to read the Montreal Manifesto. There were also specific protests organized against the Quebec government during the International AIDS Conference. There was an action directed at the Quebec Health Minister and the Bourassa government that included a banner being unfurled, widespread booing from the audience, and 20 people disrupting her speech. That was a very significant action to begin to critique the inadequacies, the criminal inadequacies of the Bourassa government's response to AIDS and HIV. There was a very significant evaluation, from our vantage point anyway, reading it now, of the activism at the AIDS conference by Réaction SIDA. Réaction SIDA noted the very powerful success and victory of taking over the opening session of the conference, which led to people living with AIDS and HIV now being included much more centrally in the organization of these types of conferences. And also a lot of support from Réaction SIDA for the support they got from AIDS Action Now and ACT UP for the Quebec-specific action. But as you can imagine, the bringing together of AIDS Action Now from Toronto, the bringing together of ACT UP from New York City and other ACT UPs from the United States, and Réaction SIDA, which was a relatively new group operating in a fairly different political and national context, there were an awful lot of tensions as well. And this evaluation is really interesting in terms of getting us to think about different organizing cultures and the priorities of organizing of different groups. So the evaluation statement actually raises really interesting questions around gender and sexism in AIDS organizing, age and ageism in AIDS organizing, race and racism in AIDS organizing, questions of language and questions of nation in AIDS organizing, and also how do we make decisions when we're all here together in terms of a collectivity of people to be most effective and most participatory. Now, in terms of the legacy of Réaction SIDA, which did not last that long, people were really burnt out after the conference. People had put an incredible amount of energy into it, and again, I want to underline, without Réaction SIDA and the work that they did, the AIDS activism that occurred at that conference would have been much less effective and much less widespread. One of the things that Carl pointed out to us when we talked to him was that unlike some other organizations that were AIDS activist organizations, in Réaction SIDA was not built around a core of people who were personally living with AIDS, and there was a lack of people who were out, who were living with AIDS and HIV in Réaction SIDA. And this was a significant difference between Réaction SIDA and some other AIDS activist groups. Réaction SIDA continued for a number of months after the conference and undertook some very interesting and initial prisoner support and solidarity work. Carl remembers, for instance, a demonstration outside of the Parthenay Roman Center where the prisoners inside actually could hear the protest in solidarity with them outside, and also remembers the support that was organized for a hunger strike by 3 HIV-positive prisoners who were being denied medical treatment inside the prison. Penny had this really wonderful expression she used in describing the sort of legacy of Réaction SIDA, which was sort of the ripple effects that it had in relationship to people's lives and people's organizing. So one of the things that's really important to recognize that without Réaction SIDA and the work, the activist work that it did at the conference, that the space for ACT UP Montreal to emerge may not have been there in the same type of way. She also underlines for us, and other people in Réaction SIDA underlines for us, because Réaction SIDA was a group that was actually very significant numbers of women were involved in Réaction SIDA, unlike many other AIDS activist groups. And in Montreal, it actually provided an example of lesbians and gay men working together in much more profound ways than was usually the case in organizing experiences in Montreal. And this actually established certain linkages and connections and networks that could be built upon in the future. And it's also important to recognize that Réaction SIDA's politics and perspective actually provided the basis for some of the people involved in Réaction SIDA to be very involved in support for people at Ganasatake and Ganawake during the opioid crisis in the summer of 1990. So that's basically ending the section on Réaction SIDA. We're now moving into talking about ACT UP Montreal, which is formed about 6 months later, and I'm now turning it back to Alexis.
How is everyone doing? Are you okay? Yeah? Does anyone have anything burning they need to say or ask right now? I know that's going off script of the plan, but you're all like, no, we're staying on script. Keep talking. Okay, good. We will do that. So, as Gary said, ACT UP Montreal came out of this context where there was a dissolution of Réaction SIDA and a need. And René Leboeuf said there was a pressing need to do something because nothing was being done and people have no resources, nowhere to go. We had to do something about that. So, ACT UP Montreal forms after the conference here, the AIDS conference. And there's a lot of connections with ACT UP New York in particular. So it's hard to trace these things, but one of the things that I keep noticing whenever people talk to me about this is the webbings of affect and filiation and love and desire. So really a lot of people knew about things that were happening in New York because they had lovers in New York, or people moved to Montreal because they had new lovers here because they'd come to the AIDS conference here. So just, that the political significance of dating, basically, as a motor for movements. So there's a couple of key people, and so there's a guy named Jamie who had studied medicine, done a lot of interesting stuff, was studying here. Another person that Gary mentioned earlier that you saw in the film, also Blaine. And so that connection really informed and gave some infrastructure for some of the ways that the work here seems to have been really effective. It was also really significant that they worked with the treatment group of ACT UP worked with the Persons Living with AIDS group, CEPAVI, on drug access funding. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is a sort of grainy newspaper photo of the first manifestation, and then this is a much later flyer. And these are beautiful photos from René, who I just quoted, of that first demonstration. So everyone noted that it was really cold, because it's one of those things about organizing in Montreal that when you do a die-in in March, you're going to be really freezing, but they did it. And so this kind of iconic gesture that's also quite moving. René says, it started out with just treatment prevention and then grew. First of all, very early on, we created a women's caucus. And then, of course, we had an HIV positive caucus. And then we had a people of color caucus. And in a little bit, I'll talk and play a little clip from the campaign that this comes from. So this was part of the treatment access campaign to include people living with HIV and AIDS in the category of people who could get funding for drugs without having to be on social assistance or go into hospital, into an institution. And Michael Hendricks is going to tell us about this. So I want to emphasize this is just like one of the things that they're doing alongside a lot of other things.
What we observed was that, what CEPAVI and ACT UP observed, was that people would go, working people, normally young men, some young women, would stop working because they wanted to get on, they had to get on BS, welfare, to get access to drugs. And it was even, you didn't have to pay $2 at all, you didn't pay anything. But that led to malnutrition, to depression, and to early death, we felt. And so the idea was to keep them up and walking, malades sur pied, and to keep them busy and integrated in life while still having their medicine. The Barraza government saw this as just awful, a waste of time and money. Anyway, they were hoping we would die. And so we campaigned for 3 years on that. It was endless.
So in doing this campaigning around treatment, Glenn Betteridge said, people became polymaths. Like in contradistinction to nowadays, everybody knew about treatment. Everybody knew the basics about treatment because that was the game, and that's what people were clamoring for. I think treatment was the focus, and services, making services and treatment accessible. So we don't remember this, but there was this moment where people really knew quite a lot about the science involved in what different treatments did, what they meant, what it was like. Michael continued and said, the campaign went on and on and on. They never bent. They never even acknowledged what we were doing. But when the PQ beat the Liberals in '95, they quickly brought it in. Not as what we wanted, but rather as an insurance plan, which is the pharmaceutical prescription insurance that everyone in Quebec has now. And so this is something that we have seen now in a couple of places. So this is not unique to Montreal and Quebec, that AIDS activists are the people who saw that if you don't have access to drugs, you do not have health justice. And they were not just interested in forming that possibility for health justice for people living with AIDS. Consistently, AIDS activists went to the governments and said, what are you going to do? The drugs are there, but we're still dying because people can't afford them. And it's not right that people should have to spend all of their savings, go on welfare in order to get drug benefits. And for example, this happened also in Ontario. The government said, cool, we'll give you just money for AIDS patients, okay? And AIDS activists, many of whom were dying because they couldn't afford drugs, said, no, everyone who can't afford drugs needs this, not just AIDS patients. So this is one of these things where, when we're thinking about the history of the present that we live and the reason that many of us are alive, we have to recognize the people who did that. Do you know what I mean? It's really important. And so when we look at these things that everyone kind of can just take for granted, that goes without saying now that everyone has access to, it's because of this work. So yay. So simultaneously with doing all that, they were doing all these other things. So Karen said, at one point, ACT UP Montreal, this must have been World AIDS Day 90, did a specific World AIDS Day march around women and HIV, and started it by having the exact number of people in masks at the front, representing the women who had died, 71 or something. I remember being part of that. And I think this image is just so striking, right? So these people who are holding the masks of the women who have died. And this is one of the photos that's available in the archives now that Renee gave. But then you look at these and it really deepens, right? So these are this is the next year, 93 people are dead, and the year after that, 147 women. And of course this is part of also a national problem where the ways that people thought about the disease, the ways that people diagnosed what HIV was and what AIDS was, had been formed on a model that was based on male bodies. And so there were all these symptoms, right? So pelvic inflammatory disease, all these cervical cancer, all these things were not understood as markers for HIV and AIDS, and so women would not get diagnosed. In the US, one of the slogans was, women don't get AIDS, they just die from it, because there was no way that you could be diagnosed because of the way that the disease was classified. So it was really significant that ACT UP had these women's actions. How many people have been to the Parc de l'Espoir? Good. And Glenn talks about this, which I think is interesting. He sort of talks about how it all came together. He says, it was that engagement with the municipal bureaucracy to try to get that memorial. And it wasn't intended in true ACT UP fashion. It wasn't intended to be a memorial garden or like a cemetery. But it was a place of gathering, of anger, of activism, a whole range of things. It wasn't just a pretty monument. And it had traditionally been a park where guys had hung out and cruised and spent time watching the people go by on that busy stretch in the village. So I remember the activism and the campaign around that, and just tying red ribbons in the trees. Some people say it was black ribbons, so there's some, history. It's complicated. Those were heady moments, feeling very engaged, empowered, way beyond your comfort zone. Drugs were not needed. There was enough adrenaline, psychotropic drugs. And he says, HIV drugs were always needed, but psychotropic drugs, yes, it was like the natural high of doing something and feeling powerful. And this is also something that we hear over and over again. People routinely say, that was like the worst time I had ever had in my life, and still when I look back on it, like I can't believe the pain that I came through. And at the same time, all of us felt incredibly alive, and it was partially that we felt so alive about being able to transform the world. Like we actually could tell that we were changing things, and that was an incredible charge. At the same time as we were totally devastated, right? Because it was also that you're going to a funeral every week. So I love this quality of the entanglement of working with the bureaucracy to try to get the municipality to designate something a park at the same time as all these other things are happening. So as Gary said, there was also an important thing that happened here where in the history of Montreal there was a lot of separate parties, basically. And so where sometimes there would be like nights at bars where you could not go if you're a woman, only men, or vice versa. And so one of the things that was also happening in AIDS organizing that people have told us is that people partied together, and that it was partially the political work together that enabled that, and then also the parties enabled the political work. So back to the thing about desire and social movements. So Sex Garage, how many people have heard of Sex Garage? Awesome. So these were parties, they were unpermitted, you know, this is like a normal thing. I live in Ottawa now, and people don't really have unpermitted loft parties, but I used to live in Montreal, and so, you know, this was still something that happened not too many years ago. So what we come to know as Sex Garage itself, so there's a lot of parties, but then we think about Sex Garage as a thing, is this time when they cracked down on it. And I think I meant to have these be the other way around. That this is gonna frame how the response happened. So Glenn notes that there was this big overlap between the people that were having the parties and the people that were doing active organizing. So people who were used to organizing, they were organized to organize. So when the Sex Garage party was raided, one of the things that happened in response to that was that it brought in other people. It brought in politicized party people who were in the plateau gay scene as much as people in the village. And, you know, this is because these parties were cutting across those two worlds. They were happening in multiple registers. So Karen describes basically what happened. She says, Sex Garage was this late night warehouse, and the police went in, they took off their name tags, they donned rubber gloves because they were dealing with the gays and the contagion, then, you know, proceeded to beat up, arrest, and kettle, basically, like they didn't call it kettling then. And then over several days, there was a series of demonstrations and attempts to negotiate with the police around charges that were laid that first night. So by Monday afternoon, there was a kiss-in, where at that point another 48 people were arrested, including Karen. And so the subsequent organizing all around all of that took up a lot of the summer. This was happening at the same time as Ganasatake and Ganawake. So one thing that happened was these big marches and big demonstrations in response to this brutality. And again, you know, this was all happening in the context of quite a lot of violence and queer bashing, not just from the cops. And the cops had been very brutal in arresting people. So there's various stories that people have told us that are in the transcripts about how fucked up it was. So there's a kind of crest that happens there, and also a lot of energy that goes into defending people who have been arrested. You know, that really, in reading these transcripts and hearing people tell the stories, make me reflect again on this question of what it means for us to put energy into defending people who have been arrested, right? What it means to be arrested, what it does to movements when a lot of us are taken up by the state. And so it's one of those live questions that this organizing this time raises. So actually that dissipates at a certain point, and I like the way that Glenn explains this. So he at this point was living in Toronto, and so this is looking in, but he expresses it in a way that other people also said to us. He says, the energy went to Queer Nation. This happened in other places too, like ACT UP would dissolve or move into Queer Nation, and Queer Nation would come up. Went into Queer Nation and into institutional processes of informing the Quebec Human Rights Commission and the big push for equal rights for LGBT people, among them the fight for the possibility of same-sex marriage. The agenda broadened, and I presume as the agenda was broadening, it was also because medications were starting to be covered, and coming out of the AIDS conference in '96 in Vancouver, we had the cocktail, the combination therapy, which had the Lazarus effect for many people. And people were tired. And I think at a certain point, institutions had formed, and the institutions were aware that there were resources, you know, paid positions, some sense of stability, and doing the fight on a full-time or part-time paid basis emerged.
And I'm now sort of going to do the concluding part of our presentation, and hopefully we'll have lots of time for a very animated discussion. So we wanted to remind people at the end of the achievements of this particular wave of Montreal AIDS activism. So the first one we want to underline is the significance of what Réaction SIDA did in terms of providing a basis for global AIDS activism at the 1989 conference. That this conference transformed the way in which those conferences were organized, so that people living with AIDS and HIV had to be included as central to how those conferences took place. And that was largely accomplished by what was organized through the Activist Center and by, in particular, the taking over of the opening session. So that was a really important achievement that we need to remember. It was AIDS activism that actually produced those transformations. There were also major challenges that came from Réaction SIDA and from ACT UP Montreal to the incredible limitations, the criminal limitations of the Quebec government's policies when it came to dealing with AIDS and HIV. And we haven't really even gone into this in any detail in this presentation, and hopefully people will read the transcripts we have up, and there'll be more interviews that will be going up that will have more information on this. And I think it's particularly important to underline what Alexis talked about in terms of the AIDS activist participation in an impetus for expanding treatment access and funding for people in Quebec. That without that activism, a lot more people would have died, that improved the situations for lots of people who were living with AIDS and HIV. These are remarkable achievements, and again, we have to recognize that activism does work, and that part of the problem with how AIDS is often now being remembered is that that activism is systematically cut out of the picture. And we need to put it back as central to how transformations took place in relationship to AIDS and HIV. Now, we also want to reflect on some of the problems and limitations, or some of the challenges that activism faced, and also that we as the AIDS Activist History Project have faced in terms of doing the work that we've done so far in relationship to Montreal. So for the AIDS activism that existed in Montreal during this period of time, this was an incredibly complex situation to be involved in and to navigate your way through. Questions of nation, questions of language, questions of race, questions of gender were all quite crucial and were oftentimes addressed in very significant and very useful ways, and sometimes not. But these are the same types of contradictions that we continue to face in our organizing today. And looking back on some of the ways in which activists tried to address these questions in the past is both a way to learn from their achievements as well as to also learn from perhaps the limitations of some of the responses that they had. We also need to note in a very powerful way that the recovery of AIDS activist history that we've talked about here tonight is quite limited, quite partial, and quite initial. For instance, one of the major stories of organizing in an activist and community-based sense against AIDS and HIV in the city comes from the Haitian community. None of that is actually reported here. And that's a central part of the picture and the history of activism that has to be painted into the picture. There are also many other stories around AIDS activism that we've not been able to tell you about here tonight. There's all sorts of other stories that are still forgotten and have not yet been remembered. Now, for us as the AIDS Activist History Project, our usual method of approach when we've gone to look at AIDS activism in particular centers has been to start with particular AIDS activist groups and to work out from there. So in Toronto, we started with AIDS Action Now. In Halifax, we started with the Persons with AIDS Coalition and with the ACT UP group that was there. In Vancouver, we started with the PWA Coalition, the Coalition for Responsible Health Legislation, and the ACT UP group. In most of those situations, that actually has allowed us to radiate out, to deal with most of the crucial aspects of AIDS activism that were going on. But we do have to say, in terms of an initial reflection, our strategy in Montreal of starting with Réaction SIDA and ACT UP Montreal, well, wonderful and really important in bringing into view all of the things we've talked about today, has actually allowed us to intersect much more with Anglophone-based forms of activism than with Francophone-based forms of activism. And it's actually leading us to reflect a little bit more critically on that method. And one of the things that I think we're both thinking now is that perhaps what we should have started with was not these moments, but actually the moment of rupture between AIDS service organizations and people living with AIDS and HIV in Montreal that really has a little bit of a prehistory to the emergence of Réaction SIDA and ACT UP Montreal. So this is something we're learning from and also being self-critical of, And we would certainly love to engage in dialogue with people about this. So the final message we want to leave, and hopefully in a number of ways we've relayed this to you already, is that activism works. It did work in the past. It can still work today. There's lots of things to learn from the victories and contributions of activism in the past, that it can change the world. And activists did change the world in terms of the social response to AIDS and HIV. So I think this is not something I talked to Alexis about at all, but I think I'll actually, in the spirit of ACT UP, just end off with a chant, which is, ACT UP, fight back, fight AIDS. And then there's a whole bunch of people we need to thank.